And now I'm going to pass things over to our Senior Acquisitions Editor, Megan Bedell, to introduce our presenter today. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Olivia. I'm really honored to be here and to have the privilege of introducing today's speaker and also be in the room with everyone here as all the cities roll in the US and beyond. I'm just really happy that we can all come together to learn from Zaretta. So Zaretta Hammond is a national consultant and author of the best-selling Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. She's a former high school and community college writing instructor, and for the past 25 years, she has supported schools and other institutions in deepening their understanding and application of culturally responsive practices, the science of reading, and the science of learning. In addition, she's written articles and book chapters on these topics to help educators improve instruction. Zaretta is a strong literacy advocate on these topics to help educators improve how they support students and families. She's also a member of the advisory board for the Consortium for Reading Education and serves on the Research Advisory Committee for Learning Policies Institute of Science of Learning and Development. And she's just an amazing human being that I've had the privilege to get to know more and more as we're working on her new book, Rebuilding Student Learning Power, Teaching for Instructional Equity and Cognitive Justice. So without further ado, I don't want to take any more time away from precious moments with Zaretta. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that. I hope everyone can see me because we're in webinar style, so I can't see you, but still means we can be in community this evening around this topic that I'm very excited about, rebuilding student learning power. And I think it's very timely. And so this is an opportunity to give you a little taste of kind of concepts that build on those that I shared with you in culturally responsive teaching in the brain. So it is taking us deeper into how do we empower students to be powerful learners? Because here's a little bit of the story behind this type of work that I do. And it all started with my writing students. I was a composition teacher when I was in the classroom, high school, community college, writing instructor. And it was interesting that when I sat down with students and it was time for us to confer and look at their essay and, look at how to improve it, there would inevitably be tears. And what it really helped me understand is I had to help them not only regain their confidence, but their competence. That this wasn't just a mindset or a motivational thing, that they really felt like they did not have learning power, the kind of cognitive horsepower to improve. So I started mixing the science of learning, which was new at the time, also culturally responsive teaching, although both of these have been around for a long time. But making them practical was really the goal. And so since culturally responsive teaching in the brain has come out, it's been 10 years. And one of the things that I have had the opportunity to see is that we're still having a challenge closing the knowing doing gap. So we understand that students are struggling, some of it because of the pandemic, some of it happened and was there before the pandemic. But we do know that several groups of students struggle because of what the World Bank calls learning poverty. So this is recognized around the world, and the World Bank actually created an initiative to end learning poverty by 2030. And what's really important to understand about this is wherever there's been colonization around the world, one of the tools for kind of maintaining that structure has been education. And it's not so much the content that was being taught, but the learning power. So this is how I started to think about what equity needs to look like as we're moving forward. So we're coming out of what I call this fourth generation of equity initiatives, right? Access to grade level materials, important, but still insufficient. Belonging and relationships have been highlighted. but we're not leveraging them for the purpose of getting students in their ZPD. Redesigning teaching and learning around deeper learning, UDL, and project-based learning methods. Very important, along with culturally relevant curricula and assessment, formative assessment, and assessment for learning. But these still don't actually get to the point where they are teaching the student how to move toward rigor. And so this graph I really appreciate because it talks about the two dimensions that I try to lift up in this new book. Not only instruction and content that we see on the left axis there, but the idea that we also need to build student capacity for becoming cognitively independent learners. And a lot of times we focus, right, in those fourth generation equity initiatives on instruction, making it more relevant and the content and adjusting there, but we have not necessarily taught students those skills in terms of learning how to learn. And that becomes the red line that I talk about in this notion of cognitive redlining and using the housing historical context around divesting in neighborhoods that were largely immigrant, largely people of color, largely poor people, putting a red line around them and not necessarily creating the conditions for thriving. Well, we see some of that happening in schools, and it's not because of malice directed individuals, it's hardwired into our system. And so I talk about this notion of disrupting the cognitive red line. That's cognitive justice, is building the capacity of students so we really can get underneath that. And so what I wanted to do today is just give you a little sense of what I mean by that, because the term can be very provocative, very buzzy. It sounds, kind of jargony and cool at the same time. But I really do want people to get underneath what it's about. So really thinking about how we have rationed these experiences for students is so important. And we're trying to make that turn with our focus on universal design for learning, with our focus on deeper learning and, rigor matrices and those sorts of things. But inherently, we have not touched a root of our public education system, and that is the idea that segregation was the law of the land for a long time. And part of that paradigm was underdeveloping the cognitive skills of diverse students and undermining their confidence as learners. Now, we've focused on trying to get the confidence back. But one of the things I say all the time is competence precedes confidence. And how we help students build the real learning power, that cognitive horsepower, that is going to give them the ability to see progress in closing their own learning gaps. Joel Rose talks about it as the iceberg problem. The more we don't empower students with learning how to learn skills, the more that learning gaps accumulate, and they accumulate kind of like an iceberg under the surface. We can move students through a lesson and get them to the next grade, only to find out down the road that they really are not retaining information, they're not growing background knowledge. So really wanting to make sure that we give them the power to close their gaps, because the reality is only the learner learns. So our next generation of equity initiatives really have to focus on this notion of cognitive justice at the tier 1 level, right? Moving away from just instructional access for independent learners. A lot of what we do is designed for students who already have these kind of cognitive tools, cognitive routines, know how to process information. And we have to actually move toward coaching students in these learning how to learn skills, being really explicit and not just covering content. So that's kind of the next evolution, I believe, of equity. So this means unlearning over scaffolding, because again, when students cannot do that cognitive lift themselves, we have a tendency to put in excessive scaffolds that never go away. So students become more reliant on the teacher to do that cognitive work. So moving away from a pedagogy of compliance toward a pedagogy of possibility. And that's really at the core of cognitive justice. So we have anti-racist education and cognitive capacity building. These two have to go together. Now, what I've witnessed is a number of school districts focusing on equity, embracing anti-racist education, really will only focus on implicit bias training for teachers, providing high quality grade level materials as the two paths to equity, and not really focusing on improving students' learning power. We just assume it's going to happen in the course of providing certain instruction. Well, the science of learning tells us otherwise. Just like reading, you could be surrounded by words all your life unless you are instructed in reading, rewiring your brain to read, you won't be a reader. So in the same way, we have to help students kind of build their learning power. I get this question from teachers all the time. How do I get students to engage in productive struggle and learn to carry more of the cognitive load? It's not like we have to, coerce them into doing it. We can't comply them into doing it, but we can actually create the environment and the situation in which they are leaning in and they see that progress. And that's what I want to be able to bring in this new text. It's really, how do we get students to lean in to their own learning? Because only the learner learns, right? And so being able to really understand what that means. We want them to be knowledge able to take random facts and figures and turn them into meaning making knowledge, right? Background knowledge. We don't want them just to be information full, because the information is not connected to anything. Students can't use it for comprehension or deepening their grasp of a concept. And so this becomes where cognitive justice really is visible. When we can see kids have this capacity, it means we're moving forward. So this young man reminds me of a student I'll call Adam. He was in a math class that I saw, and the teacher, he was packing and unpacking his backpack, rearranging it, doing something during the math lesson. And the teacher had a moment. She sees the student is clearly not paying attention, not only not paying attention, but has just, I'm going to do something else, right? And was very distracting. So she does her, equity cold call and kind of like I gotcha. And asked him, well, what was going on? And, to explain the equation that she had put on the board. And what I thought was really interesting in his response is he paused and he turned toward the board and he started breaking down what he understood, what he was grasping, and where he was getting stuck in his confusion. And in the moment, she had nothing for him. There was no ability to coach him past that confusion, no ability to engage him in the instructional conversation so that he could grow in that moment his learning power. And next time he tried it, he could learn from that error or that misconception. This is part of what I want to really make visible to educators. How do we coach students to really become metacognitive and metastrategic? That's really what we're aiming for. So the core of this is, how do we help every student become a good information processor? Now, Robert Marzano lifted up information processing as a key component of what it means to be a powerful student, right? Building background knowledge, having information processing ability. And information processing ability is more than just executive function. We've kind of reduced it to executive function, being organized, but we're talking about a different part of the brain. But the key point here is he identifies these two elements. academically oriented experiences. The more of those you have, the more background knowledge you build. Now, we don't have a lot of control outside of the, field trips we can provide. And now with cuts that are going on, those are going to be limited. We're going to have to really rely on nonprofits and community organizations to provide more of these academically oriented experiences for students who are low income and typically not able to participate in the kind of, enrichment activities that more well-off students can. But what he says is the game changer is information processing ability. So we look at Alan, he has both of those. But Iris down here only has low access to academically oriented experiences and low information processing ability. So part of what we have to do in order to give Iris a fighting chance is to get her up here. We can control that. We make an assumption that every student, particularly beyond third grade, comes to us with information processing ability. And yet and still, this is where the cognitive red line is drawn, and where inequity by design knows that it can kind of hardwire itself into a system and replicate the underdevelopment. So part of what I want to be able to do is lift up, how do we help students build these capacities? So in the book, I lay out the portrait of a good information processor. 6 elements that are really important that I think would be familiar to many of us, but at the same time, taking us deeper, taking us beyond kind of just the superficial application, right? Being able to actually help students develop these capacities. And in the book, I unpack each one. So we look at what is it, give you some explanation. Why does it matter? What's the equity connection? Because again, for it to be equity oriented doesn't mean I'm talking about issues of race or class or difference. It simply means I am equalizing, I am leveling the playing field. And how does it disrupt the cognitive red line? So just moving toward equity does not uproot some of the things that are already hardwired into our system. So those are the things that we want to do. So this book is really going to unpack this so that we're building capacity as teachers, teacher leaders, instructional coaches, and site leaders. So the brain science, because I love me some brain science, and is really going to take us into another part of the brain. The basal ganglia is a group of different parts of the brain that are deep in the middle of the brain, where kind of that blue area is. It's a bit connected to the amygdala, and which I talked more about in culturally responsive teaching in the brain. But I found that people were so focused on the relational part that we missed the learning part. So I really want to be able to lift this to high relief. Another question I get from teachers is, how do I get students through the lesson without excessive scaffolding? Because when we think about what gets in the way, right? Another element of that cognitive red line is a pedagogy of compliance and over scaffolding, as I mentioned before. So we want to have scaffolding. It's very important, but we also want to follow the rules of the gradual release of responsibility and be able to develop the kind of scaffold that is truly temporary. I've seen students get sentence frames and they never are, faded, that those sentence frames become crutches for students. So we want something that is going to put up a scaffold, but like the hole that is being, drilled into the side of a mountain so a car can go through, or maybe a train can go through, that this is actually going to be a permanent pathway when that scaffolding comes down. We want new neural pathways when scaffolds are faded for our students. So that scaffolding is not bad, it's just used excessively and actually leads to more dependent learning, because that is the type of scaffolding we put up that is represented with the painter scaffold on the left here. right? This gentleman in the red hat can get up to there to wash the windows or do whatever he's doing. But if that scaffolding were to come down, he can't get back to that spot. Versus when that scaffolding comes down out of that mountain, that hole's going to be there. I can go back and forth as much as I want. That's what we want our students' neural pathways to look like. That's where cognitive justice is, that they can actually use information, they can build background knowledge. So important. But it's the how-to that we're missing, closing the knowing doing gap where teachers may have this information. So we fall into the seductive shortcut that Richard DeFord talked about, seductive shortcuts and dangerous detours of over scaffolding. I don't want to go into it too deep right now, but suffice to say, as the second bullet says, when we do that without this fading, without the appropriate productive struggle that goes with it, we really rob students of that opportunity to develop and practice the skills of a cognitively independent student. So they need to have an environment that is going to support them in learning how to do that. And so this is where throughout the book, we talk about making shift happen. You know, we could use another word there, but here we're talking about the shift, change management for equity. And being able to actually think about how do we get teachers to the point of conscious incompetence? Like, I don't know how to do this yet, but I'm building my capacity to coach my students. And it's double loop learning because now the teachers are trying to get better at coaching their students, not just covering their content, not just lesson design. All of those things are important, but they are not the same as the student getting coached and developing their skills to learn new content and turn it into background knowledge. So in the book, I really try to summarize throughout the chapters these 6 steps. And I want to just kind of give you an overview because I really do think, I call it the pedagogy of possibility. And the possibility isn't so much in the content that you are imparting to the student, right? This is not social justice history lessons. Nothing wrong with social justice history lessons. But the pedagogy of possibility is that we are teaching students kind of a junior version of the learning game, right? When they're going to go to college, they're going to be encountering new information. When they go out into the work world, constant new information. And if we don't give them these skills of learning how to learn, then they are going to get left behind. And so we want them to be empowered. This is the essence of liberatory education, if you will. So step 1, creating the right conditions. That means decolonizing and rematriating. And I break those down, right? Decolonizing is what you're saying no to. Things, practices you want to pull out. Rematriating is what you want to say yes to, what you're putting in. Step 2, teaching students the algorithm of learning how to learn. This is not usually what we talk to students about. And we're not just talking about organizing your binders and that sort of thing. It's very important, but we're actually talking about their learning moves. And having language for that is something we don't typically give teachers. Step 3 is initiating students into a cognitive apprenticeship. So this idea of creating the right conditions and rematriating, one of the ways we're doing that is bringing in apprenticeship. That's a very collectivist learning principle. And it's very aligned with the science of learning that undergirds it all. So the idea that students in an apprenticeship are aware that they actually have to pay attention. This is the metacognitive awareness, but they also have to do new things. They have to change their moves. You can imagine medical residents that are following around a doctor. You know, we see it in the TV shows all the time. Well, they're writing in on their pads or they're taking notes. Why? Because they understand that they have to build their skill and capacity to do that thing. A lot of times we don't capture students' attention to do that. So step 4 then sets up a way in which we're doing that, right? The structures and routines to engage in the kind of one-to-one coaching conversations that I call instructional conversations. You are talking about learning how to learn in the context of the content. This is not, higher order thinking skills, right? We did that back in the day. We decontextualize it from what we're actually learning and the elaboration stage of information processing. Well, in order to process information, you actually need content. So these two go together. And how do we integrate those throughout a lesson, throughout how we're teaching, the opportunities to set that up for students to develop those cognitive routines and structures? Number 5 then actually helps us think about creating opportunities for students to become meta-strategic through productive struggle. So a lot of times we can look in classrooms and students really don't have opportunities to do the kind of productive struggle that will grow their dendrites, grow their brain power. And that's what we want to be able to do. So those opportunities for students to become meta-strategic are deeply connected to what's happening in those instructional conversations. And that is in the container of that cognitive apprenticeship. And lastly, it is an ongoing developmental process to coach students to refine their unique cognitive algorithm to improve and accelerate information processing, especially the elaboration stage. I know right now it's very popular for us to do retrieval practice and interleaving and those sorts of things, but that's the consolidation part. I've already turned the random facts and figures into usable knowledge, and now I just consolidate using those methods. But we still have not helped our dependent learners really refine their ability to do that, turning inert information into usable knowledge. That is where disruption of that cognitive red line is really going to happen. So throughout the book, I'm talking about this idea of metacognitive, metastrategic processes to develop in those phases, grasping content, uncovering conceptual relationships, helping a student identify their choke points and pitfalls. And even what are the 6 learn to learn skills associated with each process? So we actually unpack that. I unpack those, give you some ways to start to integrate that into your practice and working with your PLC, working with your coach to really dig into that. In addition, we pair those with cultural learning tools, and cultural learning tools are the tools that come out of that cognitive apprenticeship: memory, perspective taking, puzzles and patterns, and word play. Now, we can use those 4 categories throughout these various phases. This is why you see it showing up a couple of times. When do we want to reach for a tool that will support that element? And we're reminded in our far right column how this all connects to the information processing cycle, getting the attention, moving a student through elaboration, and aiding in consolidation. So this is not pick a strategy and we're going to all do that one strategy. This is literally becoming the personal trainer of students' cognitive development. And coaches, if you're an instructional coach, how do you help teachers do that? If you're in a PLC, how do you bring this notion to designing the kind of interventions that you're going to try in the classroom versus the implementation of one strategy everybody's going to try? Then our eye is focused on the strategy, not on the student. So this book really wants us to move our gaze back to the student. That's the next iteration of equity. That's where liberatory education is going to really prevail. And I talk about that in the sense of having to manage change, right? And here are 5 change hacks that I share. Get your mind right? What are the mental models that we need to adjust, not just mindsets? Disrupt yourself. How do you commit to growing a new skill as a personal trainer of students' cognitive development? Get your hands in the loom. That means, we're coming into spring, people are going to start doing gardening. And there's that loom, that wonderful gardening dirt that is going to help a garden grow, right? Learning by doing. This is why a cognitive apprenticeship is so important. Then we're going to lean into the science of habit formation. James Clear talks about this. BJ Fogg talks about this notion of atomic habits and tiny habits. How do you create a change snowball so that you're using the science of change to make shift happen? Again, versus just doubling down on a strategy and thinking that implementation fidelity is going to actually lead to students using new practices. It just means that you've rolled it out nicely, but it doesn't mean that the students are actually using it, right? And the final one is prepare for internal and external pushback, meaning anytime we change internally, we have to realign our own identity. Who am I? Am I the personal trainer of students' cognition? I don't know how to do that. Well, we have to reclaim that because there's a part of us pushing back on change. We may have competing commitments. I want to not rock the boat and try things, and I just want to kind of keep it even keel so I don't get dinged if I don't get it right the first few times. Well, nobody gets it right. You know the theory of the first pancake. That first pancake is just messed up, burnt on one side, gooey on the other, but nobody shuts down the kitchen. So if we don't give ourselves the space to change, then we're never going to go through the necessary trial and error. And that's why change management becomes so important as part of moving toward cognitive justice. The external pushback comes with, well, you should be on this, page because that's what the pacing guide says, right? This is just one example. So there are a lot of forces in our environment, in our context, that want to keep the status quo. And we have to actually figure out how to push back, not by, pushing back and being loud and disruptive, but by making small changes, right? Being able to actually shape that path, getting more people to try this new thing, showing how it actually empowers students. So I'm really excited in bringing together things that I have not seen brought together: the science of learning, the science of change, right? The idea of cognitive justice being the next frontier. And as I start to wrap up, here's the last thing I really want to highlight is this work is going to be so ripe for our PLCs, because what I see often is PLCs are data-driven meetings, as they should be, but sometimes we get caught up in the data, even if it's street data, very important in terms of that level of understanding who the student is. But how are we then designing an intervention, right? The thing we're going to try to do different around our effort to move the student from dependent learning to cognitively independent learning. That's a very different thing than I'm going to try accountable talk. So all I have to do is implement accountable talk, get some students to participate, and I can say, I'm doing accountable talk, versus can I get the dependent learner to let go of these dependent behaviors? The over-reliance on the scaffolding, the not knowing how to get him or herself out of confusion, right? Becoming more meta-strategic. That's where we're going to start to see some traction in terms of being able to do that. So I leave you with this thought that the goal of rebuilding students' learning power, teaching for instructional equity, and cognitive justice is about disrupting, but it's about disrupting in a way that is about rethinking and reinventing and repositioning, that we're still pushing for equity without having to get caught up in jargon or only focusing on implicit bias, but moving to that next level. It's a both and, not an either or. All right, I am going to pause there and stop sharing. Woo, that was a lot. And I am looking very forward to taking some questions. Thank you. I see somebody, I'm going to take a sip of water because that was a lot.
Yes, thank you so much, Zaretta, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We did get quite a few questions coming in, so we'll go ahead and get to those.
Yeah.
And feel free to leave more in the chat as we go. Even if we don't have time, we'll collect all of them and make sure that Zaretta sees them. All right, so let's start with this question from Ruth. What are some practical strategies that teachers can use to help students develop metacognitive skills?
Well, here's the thing I want you to understand. This is not anything that I can say, do these three things, because this is where we kind of get off base. How do we do this? In the sense that if you've not created a cognitive apprenticeship, just doing a few things to get students to be metacognitive is actually not going to be sticky. And it's actually going to take you down the path where you think I'm doing it, but you've not created the container. That's why those 6 steps are the steps that are interlocking and compounding. So what I would say first is set up a cognitive apprenticeship. What does that mean? It means that when you start at the beginning of the school year or when we come back after winter break, you are very explicit with students that you are going to focus on helping them become better learners. You're going to ask them to think about what they've learned, what they've taught themselves outside of school, and help them actually reflect on what their moves are. So this is kind of making their thinking visible, their invisible processes visible. So in essence, in having that conversation and setting it up where they have regular time to talk about that, not as a one-off or, hey, we did that, had that conversation. So maybe as a first start, you create that container and then they get a learning log, right? What did you struggle with? What did you do when you got confused? And what's so important is to include the emotional part as well. How did you manage your emotions? What feelings came up? Because for a lot of our dependent learners, they have a tendency to stop themselves. I'm feeling overwhelmed. How do you center yourself again? So this is regulation, but remember, emotion close to cognition. And how do you help them stay in it, right? Because a lot of students will just stop thinking you're supposed to tell me that. They haven't even reflected on the fact that I have learning moves in my head. Right? So there's a way in which we want to create the conditions, seed the conversation, and then just have a period of time where they're just paying attention, right? And it could be that part of what you do is to say, I'm going to put a timer on, and that timer is going to go, they're doing some work 10 minutes. 10 minutes, timer goes off, and it's like, pull your journal out. Think about what you are thinking about. Think about how you're processing that. What's getting your attention, right? Because if you don't know, you won't teach them how to be metacognitive. One of the things I think happens is we think metacognition, thinking about our thinking. But if you have low-level thinking, guess what you're thinking about? Metacognition doesn't make your thinking better. It just makes you aware so that you can actually manipulate it. So that's my offering. Start by talking with students about what does it mean to learn? Don't throw jargon at them. Don't talk about brain science. Just talk about we're learning stuff. And what do you do when you're trying to learn something new?
All right. And then our next question was from Jennifer. What are some ways that we can measure that we are actually building, quote, a good information processor?
Yeah, I think this is back to the idea, and this is what I try to unfold in the book. What would you be listening for? So I talk about kind of grasping concepts. This is a key element. Does a student grasp concepts? And so I have a scale from 1 to 5 in terms of the student's ability to grasp. Also, we look at the student's ability to see relationships between things. And so those are very explicit. I can't go into all the details here. We don't have enough time. But the book definitely tells teachers, here are things you're looking for. You're actually looking to see what the student is saying and how they're behaving or approaching their learning differently as you're teaching them these learn to learn skills. So we break those down, ask students to use them, and you're coaching the students to use them. So yeah, we would be listening for those things.
All right, perfect. And then Polly asked, what suggestions are there for teachers who are ready for the pedagogy of possibility, but leadership is focused on covering content, and culture for teachers is dominated by mandates that serve adults over kids?
Well, here you're going to have to hide the vegetables. And so, what that means, I was a parent whose kids didn't want to eat vegetables. And so what I end up doing is making sure that these conversations about how you're learning are part of the content. And actually, these are standards. So if we start to understand, this is why PLCs become so important. You shouldn't have to hide the vegetables, because this is not a matter of not covering content. This is actually helping students get higher up on Webb's depth of knowledge wheel or Bloom's taxonomy, so that there's a direct connection to actually doing standards-based teaching. This is not an add-on. This is actually what teaching is supposed to be, not covering your content. That's not instruction. That's covering content. And the instruction part is making sure that the student can turn that information, which is inert, I'm just learning it, into usable knowledge, because the science of learning says that has to be integrated for it to actually become part of the student's background knowledge. So these are all words that leadership is throwing around. And so we need to know the language of learning so we can anchor and twist, right? Anchor in what they're asking for, but twist so that we're creating that cognitive apprenticeship in the classroom. It's not going to take away minutes. It's just about how you're setting things up and the opportunities for students to engage in productive struggle. I don't know any principal saying, stop that productive struggle. Stop helping those children learn. This is liberatory education, right? So this is what we're after.
I love that so much. All right. And then Jessa asked, how do you apply this for students who battle anxiety that can shut them down and guide them through productive struggle?
So for the teachers to have that anxiety, or the students? I'm not sure I heard that.
I think the students who have anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is why the change part becomes so important, because we really are wanting to focus on all learners with a special focus on dependent learners, because what's good for them is good for everyone. All students are trying to improve, but for dependent learners, they've become they've got an internalized script about who they are as learners. So this is why a cognitive apprenticeship is so important, and they are a community of learners. Right? Residents who are at a teaching hospital, they're a community of soon-to-be doctors. They know what they're up, so they talk shop, right? We don't put students in the position to talk shop about learning. It doesn't sound like it would be fun or, sexy, so we don't do it. And we just keep covering this content. Well, we do. Kids are learning stuff out in the wild. I call out of school, out in the wild, all the time. They're on YouTube. They're learning how to build go-karts and computers and robots. But we don't bring that into the classroom. We put all this jargon and all this other stuff on it versus what do you do when you're left to figure it out, right? Some of these other modalities are trying to move through that. So we have to get the dopamine higher, where the students are actually having little success, right? And this is where success compounds. Oh my gosh, I made that happen. Oh, I'm not confused about that. They get a hit of dopamine in the brain. This is where the basal ganglia is really important to understand, that interplay. That dopamine spurs them to continue to actually process that information. And the more they do that, the more they get this cognitive horsepower. It's just really important for us as educators to know this science so that we can help the student kind of bring down their emotion. That's why one of the components of a good information processor is the ability to manage emotions during cognition, not just manage emotions. Like a lot of people are like, oh, we're already doing that. But we separate it too far removed. Like we'll have a morning meeting and we'll journal all these things. But when we're in the thick of it, we don't bring those skills back. And when we do, we let the student move out of their zone of proximal development to go to the corner to regulate and then come back. Well, by that time, it's all gone. motivation is
Hmm.
gone versus kind of leaning in and that ability to actually do that. So it becomes so important for us to do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Uh, and then Christy asked, how do these practices translate for those who have limited student contact time? So like teachers of music, art, physical education, things like
Yeah.
that.
This is such a great question because what I say is our specialty teachers are our reinforcers. So while they are not teaching content in the same way, they're not teaching, reading, they're not teaching social studies. They are always teaching these learn to learn skills, or at least they're reinforcing them, right? Because again, they're helping students build stamina. With music teachers and art teachers, they're teaching them the studio habits. And so this is what I talk about. We need to imagine the classroom as a studio or as a dojo. Now, in a studio, you learn how you care for the instruments or how you care for the paintbrushes, or this is the apprenticeship part. But we do not do that in our regular classroom. So again, when a school is aligned around this way of teaching and cognitive apprenticeship, then specialty teachers know the language too. They're not outside of what's happening in the PLC. They are talking about how the students is actually engaging in some learning transfer. Oh, that stuff I'm learning in music, not just about music, but about caring for and paying attention to as a musician and apprenticing as a musician is actually what I'm also doing as a learner in my subject area, right? And so again, it's helping young people see that connection, but also reinforcing. They are actually on the front lines of that reinforcement. Very important part of the equation.
Absolutely. All right. And then we had a question from Mimi. They said, this all sounds wonderful. It seems like it requires a lot of individual attention to be a student's personal trainer. I'm wondering how this looks in a classroom of 20 to 30 students.
Yeah, I don't think it is because I don't think it requires you to be the personal trainer of one-on-one. I've got 20 kids, now I got to do one-on-one. When I was a writing teacher, I had to conference with my students. We had to look at their essays and have, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. They were older, but every student does deserve the opportunity to talk about their own growth. And when we have systems set up, you can rotate through those students. So one of the simple tasks that are not tasks, but strategies I encourage teachers to do is get some index cards, not the little ones, but the big, 6x4, write at students, get 5 cards, write students' names at the top, and you're going to pay attention to those students as learners for that week. You're going to write down what you're noticing about them, how they get stuck, how they manage their emotions close to cognition, right? These 6 components. You're going to get some data on them so that when you do talk to them, even if you have 5 minutes, you have some stuff to bring in. And you're going to, with them, this is the alliance part of that learning partnership, you're going to say, hey, let's see next week if you can shift these 3 things. Right? If you can make a little progress. So it's kind of like getting stronger in the gym. You don't need the trainer to go home with you. You only have 1 hour out of a week. The trainer empowers you to actually do these things on your own, right? And so the index cards are, you just do that. And that 1 week, you set those down, you get 5 more the next week, write 5 names at the top. And in 6 weeks, you will know so much about your students as learners. So you don't get tripped up on the personal. I can't do that. I don't have time. The idea is we all can notice and name things about our students so that when we're in conversation with them, the teachable moment, or when we're conferencing with them, we are talking about their learning. And we're not talking about learning styles. Stop that. That's been debunked. We're talking about building their metacognitive and metastrategic capacity. And little ones know this. We don't have to use the big words, but the idea that I can understand something, I can understand how much I grasp it. So again, this kid watching technique, it's used in Montessori, it's used in Waldorf. We don't use it a lot because we have a tendency to pay attention to our content, not to students.
Mhm. All right. Our next question is from Sarah. Does the book have case studies, or can you share any outcomes for kids that you've seen? Curious to hear what the growth looks like.
Yeah, I think we all are curious to see what other people have done. I think what's missing is the how to. Here is the recipe for doing it versus the results. Results may vary, and we have a tendency to get kind of caught there. So I have folks who I've coached who they've seen growth in their students. They send me this information. But I don't share those because those are the end result. And I think we have a tendency to, well, show me how that worked in their classroom. But what you don't see is all the ugly up and down, all the stress,
Mm-hmm.
all this stuff. So case studies in many ways are, or the end result are kind of misleading versus how do we in our PLC go through it? Like, how do you have a few sparks at your school that go through it, write down, document their experience, and bring their colleagues into it? So that's what I suggest when I start to talk about how do we reimagine PLCs. You will start to have those case studies because they are from your context in your school. Because my experience is the minute I show the case studies, people say, I can't do that because they did. There's a reason. Again, this is that
Mm-hmm.
internal and external pushback, why we can't do something versus I'm actually going to create case studies in my classroom. I'm going to have a
Mm-hmm.
focal student or these three focal students. And in the course of an academic year, you could have 6 or 7 case studies with other teachers. And then those are your kids. That's not somebody else's kids. You don't know what other supports those people had. Your context matters. This is that next gen equity. It's like our context, can we move our students? Are we doing things that continue to create a cognitive red line?
Absolutely. So our next question comes from Renee. It feels like you're bringing together SEL, self-reflection, metacognition, and brain-based learning and academic content, all the while raising the cognitive rigor for students. Am I understanding this correctly? And if so, what key points would you share with teachers and leaders that they will see this as moving forward and not just, oh, we've already done that work or we've been there, done that?
Yeah, I think 2 things. What you just described is what I've already written about in culturally responsive teaching in the brain. I brought SEL, I brought the science of learning. I don't call it brain-based learning because as opposed to what, the kidney-based learning. So the reality is learning that is centered in the science of learning, learning sciences. Yeah, I did that in culturally responsive teaching in the brain. What I'm trying to do now is help us understand how to help a student. It's a much more focused thing. It's not just bringing SEL, it's actually talking about how do you grow dendrites? How do you get the student to be meta-strategic? Because if you don't know how to get the student, if you don't even know the definition of meta-strategic, you cannot be working toward equity. These cognitive red lines are going to be hiding in plain sight. You won't know how to disrupt them. You'll just be doing stuff. And we've been down that road where nothing has changed. You looked at your data year in and year out, same kids at the bottom, same kids at the top. And it's so unchanged that we make up stories about those kids and those families. So what I want to do is actually push back a little on, oh, that's just SEL. Oh, that's just brain-based learning. That's just, we have got to shift our paradigm and say, have we actually taught the student learn how to learn? Have we taught them learning how to learn skills? This book is really just about that. It's not about, and the fact is, all of these elements, social emotional development is tied to cognition. That's just the science of learning. That's not me trying to bring academic content to. So part of what we want to do is not overcomplicate it, right?
Mhm.
The idea is we're not leaning into this area. It is all connected, as Christy says, and it always has been. But we are not closing the knowing doing gap. This book is designed to close the knowing doing gap, not trying to bring you new stuff. And we can't say we're doing it because our academic scores tell us, no, we're not. We say we are, but keep looking at your, achievement data.
Mhm.
And that's going to tell you the real truth. Closing
Abs-
the knowing doing gap. Absolutely.
All right, I think we've got time for just one more.
One
So
more.
we'll go to this question from Tina. We all learned under a redlined system. Don't we need to unlearn how we learn to learn before we try to teach students how to learn? And how do we do that?
Oh, that's such a good twisty thing. Yes. So
Hmm.
here's a part that I will say. We know how to learn. Humans do that. That is our brain's natural directive. What we've tried to do is constrain that for certain groups of kids. So what we have to unlearn is, why do we ration the kind of watered up curriculum and instruction and productive struggle and hands-on stuff for certain kids? And other kids have to earn it, right? That's the cognitive red line. Well, we're trying to, those kids have to earn it. Versus, this is actually the watering up that's going to be the equity thing we need. Not just talking about implicit bias. Yes, if microaggressions are popping off in your classroom, you need to get that checked. So you need to get some implicit bias training. But the reality is, we can have nice, well-run classrooms, but the students are not learning. And that is the real, injustice. It's not just that we have SEL and we're all singing Kumbaya. It's that that child can't read and you know it. That child has got poor comprehension and you give them nothing more than another strategy. You have to teach them these learn to learn skills. And when we deny that those exist, then we are just participating in inequity by design. We're not getting ourselves clear on how we do that. The other part to that question, though, is there is unlearning to do. So we have to unlearn how to not scaffold excessively, because that comes out of a mental model that says the student really can't, or the student's too fragile and I can't let them struggle. I don't want to see them struggle. This is the price of nice, right? And so really understanding where we do have to not jump in and rescue, right? Being able to do that is the part we unlearn, not unlearn how we learn. Because what we are doing for some students is a pedagogy of compliance, not the pedagogy of possibility, not the way we know all humans learn. The science of learning, cognitive neuroscience, has been out there a long time. We know that. What you need to stop doing is being able to, participate in the pedagogy of compliance and be okay with that, right? Restricting how students can talk or move in the classroom, or, all eyes on me, and, all of these other scripts that restrict the student, versus having that cognitive apprenticeship where the student has some freedom to engage in productive struggle. I'm not suggesting we have classrooms where the students are wilding out, but they do need to understand that their capacity to accelerate their learning is in their hands. They can grow their learning power. That's what I want to communicate in this book. So thank you all for coming to the webinar tonight. I look forward to having it on pre-order sometime in April or May, and, hopefully out by the beginning of the school year. We'll see how all that goes, but I'm super excited to get this in your hands.
Yes, and thank you so much, Zaretta, for, you know, everything that we've seen tonight. It was amazing. And if anyone has any questions that we didn't quite get answered today, I know that there were a couple we had to skip over. Feel free to send them along to us at info@corwin.com and we'll get those sent to Zaretta for you.
I absolutely will answer them too. I mean, we're in this all together.
So thank you again to Zaretta. Thank you to everyone who joined us and participated today. It was so good. And have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.